Good evening. This is Star of Bethlehem, so I hope you're all in the Christmas spirit, even though we've got quite a few weeks to go. So it's a little bit early in mid-November, but let's go for it anyway and see what happens. So this is looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew, looking at the account there of the Magi and the star in the east. I'll be asking whether or not there are astronomical candidates that could possibly fit the description in the Gospel, and I'll be looking at the dates to see whether or not only the objects themselves, but the timing of those objects could fit the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And then, to get an idea of what was in the sky 2,000 years ago, I'll run some planetarium software and see what actually was happening, and then I'll summarize at the end. So let's remind ourselves, for those not totally familiar with the Bible, what it was that was said in the Gospel of St. Matthew. So the basic points that I'm trying to address are highlighted in red in this particular slide. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem because they were prompted by a star in the east. They didn't follow the star in the east, they were prompted by a star in the east, and then they went west. So the first thing is star in the east. When they got to Herod, they asked about, what's this we hear about a birth of the King of the Jews? So why would you interpret the Star of Bethlehem as being a sign of a birth of the King of the Jews? Herod didn't seem to know what they were talking about, so is there a reason that Herod wasn't aware of their question? The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared and then stopped over Bethlehem. So those highlights in red there are the 5 aspects of the star that we would like to be able to explain. If we can find an astronomical candidate that meets 4 or preferably 5 of those points, then maybe we found a potential candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Before we jump into that, let's just remind ourselves about that wonderful Christmas carol. Sing along if you like. Come on. That's enough of that. Right. We three kings of Orient are. Let's have a think about those lyrics. 3 kings of Orient. 3. Why 3? Why 3 magi? Why 3 wise men? Why 3 kings? The Bible doesn't mention 3 people coming to see the baby Jesus. It only talks about 3 gifts: gold, Frankenstein, and myrrh. It could have been 20 people came, and only 3 of them brought gifts. And the other 17 were saying, I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts. So we've got no justification for saying that there were 3 wise men, or 3 magi, or 3 kings. So we should really take the 3 out of the carol. And where'd you get kings from? The Bible doesn't say kings. The Bible says magi, the male gender of magus, effectively a wise man. So kings was a more recent invention, so we really shouldn't have that in there either. Where were these magi from? Were they from the Orient? Or were they from Mongolia? Or were they from India? Or were they from Persia? The Bible doesn't say. All we know is they came from somewhere east of Jerusalem. So we really shouldn't be too specific. And they saw a star in the east and went west. So you could argue they didn't actually follow the star. So we shouldn't have that either. So you can see the Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And being a physicist, being a scientist, we like precision, we like accuracy. So we really shouldn't have those words which can't be justified by what's written in the Bible. I would suggest a rewording of this carol to something more like, we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, and we saw a star, because that's all you can justify from the actual account. Now you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. It doesn't really meter quite as well as we 3 kings of Orient are, even though technically it's more accurate. And we should not talk about the 3 wise men, because there's no indication that there were 3 of them. So instead of the 3 wise men, we should talk about the n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity. Probably not infinity, whatever the male population of the Earth was 2,000 years ago. Okay, fair enough. Let's do that then. So we have to remind ourselves that when we're thinking about the Star of Bethlehem, we shouldn't take the literal meaning that we understand today. We understand the astrophysics of how stars are born and how they live and how they die. But in this context, star doesn't mean star as we understand it. There's a whole load of what you might call fixed stars, stars that of course move because of the rotation of the Earth, but otherwise stay fixed in their relative positions in constellations. And as well as having a whole load of fixed stars, there are wandering stars, and wandering stars we eventually started to call planets, and we understand what they are, but at the time they were just points of light, stars in the sky that just didn't stay in fixed positions. So we have wandering stars, and we have hairy stars or broom stars, stars with tails. And so again, we now understand what they are. We now call them comets, generally speaking, but you could say they're another type of star. And of course, there's a third category where the idea of describing them as stars still survives today. Meteors are still called shooting stars from time to time. And therefore, wandering stars, hairy stars, shooting stars, we shouldn't discount planets and comets and meteors as being the Star of Bethlehem just because they don't stick with what we think of as stars. We should take star in the much more general meaning as something seen in the night sky, other than the moon, I guess, which we know looks rather different from all of the stars. So let's use that as our essential point of reference. Do we get any clues by looking not back at the Bible, but by looking at references to the adoration of the Magi since then? If we look at paintings, for instance, what do we see as the Star of Bethlehem? Well, quite often the Star of Bethlehem is literally just a point, often in the background, occasionally shining a little bit of radiance down onto the baby Jesus. But of course, not surprisingly, we don't really get any clues as to what's going on there. Botticelli, it's widely believed that that is Botticelli himself, photobombing his own portrait there on the right-hand side. Back at the back of the proceedings, we have Joseph looking very bored, not taking any part in the celebration. Maybe that's appropriate, because allegedly he didn't take any part in the conception either. And if we look at others, again, we often see the star in the background. One of the few depictions of the adoration of the Magi which doesn't have a star, which is clearly a star, is the one by Giotto, in which we clearly see something that looks more like a hairy star or a broom star. This definitely looks like a comet. And a lot of people think, well, maybe that's an indication that the comet was Halley's Comet that was actually prompting the idea of the Star of Bethlehem. There are other depictions of the adoration of the Magi. This one from Rubens is one of the few I could find which doesn't appear to have the Star of Bethlehem in it anywhere in the sky. What it does seem to have is a two-headed camel, which is quite interesting in its own right, but that's nothing to do with what we're talking about this evening. And again, other depictions, quite often a star just looks like a little point of light, perhaps shining down onto Jesus. So it's not surprising that paintings that were made many, many, many centuries thereafter don't really tell us anything about the Star of Bethlehem. But when it comes to trying to figure out what was actually going on, we have to take into account not only that we're dealing with trying to find an astronomical candidate, we have to take into account the astrological significance, because that dominated people's thinking back then. Every planet, every bright star, and every constellation in the zodiac through which the sun and the planets move, all of them had an astrological significance. For instance, Venus, or Aphrodite, was a symbol of beauty, a symbol of fertility, a symbol of birth. And Jupiter, or Zeus, was a symbol of royalty, or a symbol of kingship. It was basically the king of planets. There are various stars that have meaning. For instance, the one that will be relevant to us is Regulus. You can perhaps tell from its name, the REG at the front, that Regulus is the king of stars, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. And many cultures interpreted Leo, the constellation of Leo in the sky, as being related to or associated with the land of Judea, the land and indeed the people of Judea, because their flag had a lion on it. So the Lion of Judea became associated with the people and the land of Judea. So Leo has an association with the Jewish people. Why do people actually look at the sky and start attributing significance to what's in the sky, whether it be planets moving through constellations or passing particular stars? Why should people take notice of what the sky is doing, what the sky is looking like? Well, it's because it was believed that that is where you get messages from God. God basically tells mankind what he has in store. Is there going to be a flood? Is there going to be a good harvest this year? Is there going to be a famine? Is there going to be an earthquake? If God has plans for mankind, that will be written in the stars. And so if you can interpret the stars, you can figure out what's going to happen in the future. So think of the sky basically as being God's Facebook page. That's where he's telling mankind what's going to happen. So it's worth reading the sky to read these messages from God. Okay, so let's have a think about what possible candidates could exist. Let's have a think about the possible candidates and ask ourselves whether it meets the criteria, the 5 criteria that I laid out at the start of the talk. The fact that this would have to appear in the east, it would have to be significant. For some reason, Herod wouldn't be aware of said object or the significance of said object. The star must be able to reappear in the sky, and the star must be able to stop in the sky. If we can tick all of those 5, we might have found a candidate. So let's start with a meteor shower. If we're talking about shooting stars, could a shooting star be the Star of Bethlehem? Well, you won't really talk about a star being in the east because, of course, a meteor can appear almost anywhere in the sky. And given that meteor showers occur pretty much every year, year on year on year, a dozen or so meteor showers every year, roughly same time every year, there's no particular significance to a meteor shower showing up. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware? Well, if it's not significant, yeah, of course he would shrug his shoulders and say, what are you talking about? Can the star reappear in the sky? Well, meteors one night can reappear the next night or the next month, etc. They'll be around all year. Can they stop in the sky? It's difficult to see how you can interpret a meteor as stopping in the sky. What about a comet? Well, a comet can appear in the east. If it's bright enough, it would be significant. But if it is a really bright, significant comet, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? Herod didn't have particularly good eyesight, but he had a whole load of court astrologers, and they would have seen it, and they would have told him about it. Can a comet reappear in the sky? Well, yes, comets go around the sun, and every once in a while they might disappear behind the sun, go away from view, and then reappear sometime later on the other side of the sun. So yes, comets can reappear. Can they stop in the sky? Well, not really. You could argue as a matter of perspective it might appear to stop, but comets tend to come in at all sorts of jaunty angles. They don't tend to be restricted to the plane of the ecliptic, and therefore it's unlikely that from our perspective a comet will stop in the sky. What about a nova? What about a new star? Strictly speaking, not a new star, just a star that has become visible because it's brightened for a little while. Well, a nova could in principle appear in the east. It can appear anywhere in the sky. It could be significant if the nova is bright enough. But again, if it's a bright nova, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? Can the star reappear in the sky? Well, in principle, yes, novas can be recurrent, but they tend to be recurrent and brighten and then dim and then maybe brighten again, but usually years, decades, even centuries later, not very shortly thereafter. So it's unlikely that a nova could reappear in the sky. And would you say that a star has stopped in the sky? Well, if it's a fixed star, why would you describe it as stopping? Because it's not moving relative to all of the other fixed stars. So that doesn't seem like a sensible description. So those don't seem to fit. Supernova falls into roughly the same category. Regardless of the astrophysical explanation, you can basically treat it as a bright nova. Could appear in the east, could be significant if it's bright enough, having gone off not so far away. But if it was bright, why wasn't Herod aware of it? And given that a supernova is a star blowing itself to bits, is it possible that a star can go supernova twice? Well, not really. Once it's blown itself to bits, that's pretty much it for the star. And again, if it's a star, it's fixed relative to all the fixed stars, so why would you talk about it stopping in the sky? So that doesn't seem to fit either. So you can see what I'm leading towards. The fifth possibility looks like it might be the only explanation. The fifth possibility is a conjunction of planets. Conjunctions of planets can occur in the east, in the west, in the south, so that's fine. It can be significant depending on the astrological significance you apply to the planets involved. Is it possible Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, he might have been aware of a conjunction of planets, but maybe he didn't come to the same astrological conclusions as the Magi. Or perhaps his court astronomers realized it was bad news and didn't want to tell Herod, and therefore he wasn't aware. Can it reappear in the sky? Yes, conjunctions can occur multiple times. And can a star stop in the sky? As we'll see shortly, yes, a planet can stop in the sky. So let's just remind ourselves what conjunctions are all about. Let's just take a couple of hypothetical planets going around the sun. The one that's closer to the sun moves faster. It's got a shorter orbit and it is moving faster, so its year is substantially less than a planet moving at a greater distance from the sun. So you can see planets will appear at different points in the sky, and every once in a while planets will appear, any two given planets might appear to be in the same chunk of sky. It's unlikely they'll be exactly lined up with each other, because planetary orbits tend to be not identical in terms of their tilt. They all seem to be tilted a little bit one way or the other, and so when two planets cross in the sky, normally they miss each other. One goes north or south of the other, in much the same way that the moon goes around the Earth, but the moon doesn't cover the sun every month. An eclipse only occurs once in a, well, not once in a blue moon, but once in a while, and the tilt of the moon's orbit means that the moon normally, a new moon occurs when the moon crosses above the sun or below the sun, as seen by us. Same idea for the planets. They might miss by a few degrees, but they don't, generally speaking, line up perfectly. But they might be close together in the sky. And because the inner planets go faster than the outer planets, there is the possibility, if we imagine that we are on the green planet, let's imagine green is Earth, and the red orbit here corresponds to a planet orbiting outside the Earth's orbit, so it could be Mars, could be Jupiter, could be Saturn. They didn't know about any planets beyond that, so we'll just leave it at those three. Because the inner planets are moving faster due to the effect I've just shown you, being closer to the sun, gravity is stronger, so the planets move faster. It is possible that although planets generally move from west to east in the sky, when the Earth is overtaking on the inside lane, going faster than this planet on the outside, then the outer planet can appear to move backwards for a while. So the pattern of the motion of the outer planet on the sky can look like this, west to east, but then it can stop in the sky, go backwards for a while, stop in the sky, and then continue going forwards. Nothing to do with the motion of the outer planet, purely the perspective of the inner planet overtaking it on the inside lane because it's moving faster. So again, let me just run that animation again. Normally from west to east in the sky, but every once in a while, stop, move backwards for a short while, stop again, and then continue moving forwards as the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane. So that's all we need really to understand conjunctions and how they might appear in the sky. Let's think about what actually happened if we dial the clock back to something close to the birth of Christ. You can do this with a number of different pieces of planetarium software, but warning, bear in mind that when you come to looking at the years, if you go from 2 AD to 1 AD and then go back another year, you don't get to 0. There is no year 0. We go from 1 AD to 1 BC, using the usual convention of before Christ rather than before the Common Era. Some astronomical software, when you ask it to subtract a year from 1 AD, will tell you the year is 0. And then if you subtract another year, it'll tell you it's 1 BC. In other words, it introduces a year which doesn't actually exist. So bear in mind, if you want to reproduce anything I'm showing this evening, double check whether or not the software you're using correctly has no year 0. Just try and put in 1 and then go back a year and make sure you go from 1 AD to 1 BC. So what was going on in this sort of period? When do we think Christ was born? Answer is we don't know. We can't be definitive from biblical accounts as to when that was. It is widely believed that Christ might have been born somewhere between 4 and 8 BC. That's based on the common belief that King Herod died in 4 BC and Christ was born before Herod died. Therefore, it's somewhere in that grey area. But there is another possibility. Some biblical scholars believe that the death of Herod has been misdated because, of course, there is no document that says King Herod died this year in 4 BC, because you know that would be a fake if you ever read that in a document. King Herod died, for instance, after the lunar eclipse, which came after the flood, which came after the season of the earthquake, which came, etc. All events are dated relative to each other. And some people believe that King Herod's death has been dated by the wrong lunar eclipse. And actually, King Herod died in 1 BC, not 4 BC, in which case some people believe maybe Christ was born in this particular window here. Why nobody believes it's between 3 and 4, I don't know, but that's just what I've based on other people's research, effectively. So let's think about possibilities. What about comets that were in the sky at the time? There was a comet around in 12 BC. That was Halley's Comet, which probably was quite bright. It could have been quite spectacular. But isn't that a bit early for God to be posting on Facebook that something interesting is going to be happening quite soon? So maybe that's a bit too early. There were 2 other comets. In 5 BC, there was Comet Holmes. Don't know if you remember that from a few years back. It had a coma which suddenly expanded quite substantially. But we don't think that would have been bright enough to be spectacular enough to cause the Star of Bethlehem. 4 BC, there was another comet in principle that was in the sky. This is Churyumov-Gerasimenko. That's the comet otherwise known as 67P, the one visited by Rosetta, the one where it had a little Philae lander land on the comet. So we know about that comet. We know where it was in 4 BC, but it would have been way too faint to have been a naked eye object and seen by people as the Star of Bethlehem. So that doesn't seem to fit either. What about nova? There were nova around according to records. The Chinese said there was a nova that went off in 5 BC. The Koreans said there was a nova, it went off in 4 BC. Now, either 2 nova went off in quick succession, like buses, you wait for a century and then 2 go off very quickly. More likely, there's a dating error in looking at the Chinese calendar and the Korean calendar, and maybe they're out by a few months. So it's thought that that was actually one nova that was seen by both cultures. But for the reasons I've said earlier, nova doesn't seem to fit the bill because it's a fixed star, and so how can we talk about it stopping in the sky, etc.? And recurrent nova don't seem to fit the bill. We don't see a nova going off earlier or later. So that leaves us with conjunctions. And there were a couple of very interesting conjunctions. One was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. I'm using the astrological symbols here as indicated on the left-hand side. So that conjunction between Saturn and Jupiter was very similar to the one we saw around Christmas in, when was it, 2020? Where, again, Saturn and Jupiter were close in the sky. Jupiter quite bright, Saturn not particularly bright. But this one, I think, which might be relevant if we take the death of Herod as being 1 BC rather than 4 BC, that one, I think, is worth closer inspection. So it could well be that this one between Saturn and Jupiter is a conjunction that could be the Star of Bethlehem. But this I found quite fascinating when I started to dig to see what actually happens there. So I'm using Starry Night software. I'm looking in the direction of Leo. I am not going to bother with day and night, otherwise the animation that runs forward is going to be flickering all the time, and I'm not putting a horizon in. Trying to keep it as simple as possible. What I am interested in is what the planets are doing in this chunk of sky. I know you can't read this, but I've currently got it set to August 3 BC. Here is the constellation of Leo. There's the star Regulus. Again, I am not labeling everything in this image, otherwise the labels get really confusing. The one thing I am labeling is Jupiter. And the bright blob to its right, where I'm sure you realize a bright blob doesn't belong because that's nothing to do with the constellation of Cancer, that is the planet Venus. And what we're going to do is run the time forward and see what happens in this time period of 3 BC to 2 BC. So let's run this forward and see what happens. There's Jupiter, there's Venus, Remember, inner planets move faster than the outer planets, so Venus is going to catch up Jupiter. So we're now running forward through August to August the 12th. Venus and Jupiter are now in conjunction. They are quite close in the sky, and they are both very bright, sort of somewhere around magnitude -4. So a very bright object has suddenly come close to a very bright object in the constellation of Leo, and this would be seen just before sunrise in the east. So what are the planets involved? Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, Judea, the land of the Jews. So you could argue that Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in Leo could be interpreted as birth, king, Jew. So that's where they might get their first inclination, the astrologers who are looking at the sky, that something interesting is happening, and it looks like there's going to be a birth of the king of the Jews. They then say to themselves, that's interesting. It's obviously worth keeping a closer eye on the sky to see what happens next. Venus continues to move and will fly off to the left because Venus is moving faster than Jupiter. And that leaves Jupiter to sluggishly continue its journey around the sun. Notice that Jupiter gets very close to the star Regulus. The king of planets has just gone very close to the king of stars, a conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus. And then, after it's passed the king of stars, Jupiter stops in the sky and starts to move backwards, this retrograde motion that I showed you earlier. So Jupiter is now moving backwards in the sky, and as a consequence, Jupiter moves past Regulus a second time. So there's a second conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus, a second conjunction of the king of planets with the king of stars. Jupiter stops in the sky a second time and then starts moving forward again. We're now in spring of 2 BC. So Jupiter passes Regulus for a third time. So the king of planets has passed the king of stars not once, not twice, but 3 times in a matter of months. The astrologers might say to themselves, these kings, well, something is important about these kings because we've just had a triple conjunction of the king of planets and the king of stars. It looks like, I don't know, an old king is about to hand over to a new king. If this is the king of the birth of the king of the Jews, sounds like we ought to go to Jerusalem and talk to the current king, Herod, about this new king, this new kid on the block, and see what he says. When do we go? Well, let's just keep watching the sky and see if anything interesting happens. So we've had the conjunction. Venus has now gone all the way around the sun and is back again and is hurtling in from the right-hand side. Jupiter will continue moving towards the left. So let's move forward from May of 2 BC to about June of 2 BC. Venus is catching up with Jupiter again. Bam! Another conjunction between Venus and Jupiter, again in the constellation of Leo. Venus, Jupiter, Leo, birth, king, Jew. There is definitely something happening, say the astrologers. This particular conjunction is not just a near miss of 2 points of light in the sky separated by a fraction of a degree. This is a really, really close conjunction. And we can only appreciate how close it is. Remember, we haven't got any telescopes 2,000 years ago, so there was no way anybody would see the sort of detail we're going to see here. Let's center it up and zoom in just so you can see how close Jupiter was to Venus. Let's zoom in and see. How close do you want it? The 2 disks would, remember, this particular field of view is smaller than human vision could possibly see. So in other words, they would not appear as 2 disks, 2 points of light. For any human on Earth looking at this conjunction, they would appear to be 1 point of light. A very bright planet Venus and a very bright planet Jupiter would appear to merge as one. A conjunction that's this close, so close that the 2 planets as seen from Earth, the 2 disks would effectively overlap ever so slightly, depending on exactly where you observe it from. A conjunction this close would only happen a few times every 1,000 years. So it's virtually a given that no astrologer alive at the time would have seen that before. This would have been a completely new experience for them to see two planets which they knew well apparently merge into one. So this, maybe, was the starting pistol. They know about birth of the King of the Jews. They know that there's a handover from one king to another because the King of Planets and the King of Stars have just done this little dance and passed each other 3 times. And now they get this really, really spectacular conjunction between Venus and Jupiter. So to summarize what you could argue the astrologers might have seen, back in August of 3 BC, they saw a close but not necessarily spectacular conjunction, very similar to what we saw with Jupiter and Saturn back in 2020. They would have been separated by a fraction of a degree in the sky, but because it's Venus and Jupiter in Leo, you could say that is birth of the King of the Jews, the first sign. Then, in the following months, the King of Planets passes the King of Stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times, a triple conjunction. Something is happening regarding a handover of power between kings. And then in June of 2 BC, there is this absolutely spectacular conjunction where the 2 points of light merge into a single point of light that can't be resolved by any person. No one would have the visual acuity to be able to resolve them. If they then decided to go to Jerusalem and start asking questions of Herod and eventually move on to Bethlehem, how long would it take them to actually get to Bethlehem? No idea, because we don't know where they came from. We don't know whether they came from the Orient or Mongolia or India or Persia or perhaps even closer. We don't know if they were walking or if they were on camels. The Christmas cards always say they're on camels, but we don't actually know that. So we don't know how long it would take for them, if they left in June, how long until they got to Jerusalem or to Bethlehem. But it's always possible it could take them quite a few months, especially if they were walking. And it's interesting to note that in December of 2 BC, Jupiter stops in the sky again and effectively completes Matthew's account. All 5 elements of Matthew's account are now in there. So perhaps, speculation, perhaps that's when the Magi actually arrive at Bethlehem. On which day does Jupiter stop in the sky in 2 BC? It happens to be December the 25th. Now that, of course, is just a coincidence because the 25th was, of course, a Christian celebration taking over from an old pagan festival. But it's interesting to note that it is actually 25th when Jupiter stops in the sky. So maybe it was that series of conjunctions, a conjunction of planets and then a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus and then another very close conjunction of planets. Maybe that set of conjunctions was the set of observations, as it were, the set of events, if you will, that produced the account. Maybe these were seen in 3 BC and 2 BC. They were seen by lots of people, it was spectacular, and they passed the story down from generation to generation. And then when it came to write the gospel, obviously a considerable time thereafter, maybe the narrative of the Star of Bethlehem was woven into the story of the Nativity by Matthew. Maybe it wasn't that particular set of astronomical events, maybe it was a different set of events, or maybe it was a combination, maybe it was a conjunction and a comet which appeared and made people think about the Star of Bethlehem. Dealing with the astronomy is easy. Any piece of planetarium software can be dialed back to 2,000 years ago, as long as you watch out for year 0. And you can see what was in the sky when, to an accuracy of probably, I don't know, better than a minute or so. So the astronomical fact is easy to calculate. The astrological significance, second-guessing what an astrologer would actually say, what significance they would actually attach to what they were seeing in the sky, that, of course, is just speculation, because we don't know what astrologers thought. We can only make assumptions about what they thought. But regardless of that, the underlying message, of course, is still the same. Despite it only being November, let me wish you all a very Merry Christmas. Thank you.